So my talk is mainly concentrated on this case study that is part of a larger project I'm working on, and this project specifically concentrates on this interwar poetry books that are illustrated with photography of photomontage from Soviet Russia, interwar Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. So across the Central Europe and Soviet Russia during the historical avant-gardes. And so this talk will be about this book that I co-translated and co-edited with my colleague Ainsley Morse. And the book, as you see, is published in this lovely series, and it includes in it a facsimile from the 1933 original edition. But before I continue, let me just give you a little outline and the overall structure of my talk. So, first I will very briefly introduce you to Belgrade Surrealism, Aleksandar and Dušan Matić, and their photopoetry artwork, as well as the political climate of Yugoslavia in the 1930s. And at the end of the section I will lay out my argument. And in the second part I will explain the surrealist interest in renewal of the children's literature and provide a general overview of the book, focusing particularly on Matić's foreword and Vučas's narrative poem, as well as on its fabula. And then I will introduce several surrealist concepts that are very important for reading this book. And I will later introduce the aesthetical and ideological concepts that were in the service of Yugoslav surrealists, and offer also close inspection of Matić's collage within the book. And its potentially subversive role within the symbolic economies of the Yugoslav society at the time. And in this section I will lay out my argument in more detail. And at the end I will just conclude delineating the historical trajectory of the Belgrade Surrealist Circle after the Second World War and their artistic creation. So let me start, and bear with me, this will be a little bit layered and sort of I hope rich. So unlike most other surrealist groups outside of France, such as Romanian, Czech and Japanese, which were active only from the late 20s, beginning of the 30s, Yugoslav surrealists, similarly to Belgian surrealists, were coexisting with early development of the surrealist movement in Paris. And Yugoslav or Serbian or Belgrade surrealists movement in Yugoslav arts ran simultaneously with one in Paris. It lasted from 1922 as proto-surrealism to 1933. Even the production of the individual works continued until the 1939. And representatives of Belgrade surrealism, Marko Ristić, Aleksandar, Dušan Matić, to name just a few, from their earlier times in youth had contacts with French literature, primarily through their education and later through their prolonged stays in France. They espoused the new avant-gardist ideas taken directly from French magazines and books, and prior to 1924 through personal contacts established between André Breton and Marko Ristić, because Marko Ristić would spend times in Switzerland. He was also paying subscription to La Littérature, so he very early contacted Breton and they were in correspondence. In the late 1920s, other French and Belgrade surrealists met personally and established contacts, and as attested by their correspondence and by a large number of print matters that they exchanged and preserved in personal archives, we could say that these contacts were very alive. And among many editions of, that testify to the Belgrade surrealist interest in aesthetic, political and philosophical potential of photography, I will just mention a few. One is the journal Svedočanstvo, or Testimonies, which feature the photos of tattoos, for example. One is a small book featuring a longer poem illustrated with photomontages and lithographies, considered the first photo-illustrated surrealist poem from 1926, even before Breton's Nadja. It also had these photomontages in that book, and I'm translating, actually including this book in the anthology that I'm preparing, that I mentioned at the beginning. And also I want to mention this interesting bilingual almanac, L'Impossible or Nemoguće, which was published in May 1930. And this book represents the first Yugoslav model of avant-garde multimedia work that moved the set boundaries not only of belles lettres but also of fine arts. And I should also mention several photo-illustrated works, such as Dušan Matić's photo poem Murky Fishing in Clear Waters, and Aleksandar Vučo's and Marko Ristić's paper movie Crustaceans on the Chest, as well as a little bit later in the 30s made Marko Ristić's photo collages. And this is just like to give you a little survey of artworks that is of a hybrid nature, right? Connecting more to the visual crossover with literature. And another exquisite and really important addition is the 1933 book, The Fine Feats of the Five Cockerels Gang. And this book actually marks the symbolic end of historic avant-gardes in Yugoslavia, although it was published as a separate edition in September 1933, after the collective surrealist movement in Belgrade had ended. This book is still deeply connected to the entire movement and represents one of its specific expressions. Published in a series called Surrealist Editions, The Fine Feats is a collaborative creation by the two prominent Belgrade surrealists, Aleksandar Vučo, who wrote verses, and Dušan Matić, who authored the foreword to the book, unconventional collages and prose interludes which functions as explanations of these photo collages. So collaboration between two of them dates back to the mid-1920s, when they experimented with the fusion of different genres and produced several intermediate works. Especially is interested maybe the middle one, which I won't go into detail because I don't have time, but we can discuss it in the Q&A if interested. And let me say a few words about both of them were belonging to the Serbian intellectuals that were educated in France after the First World War. Dušan Matić especially hold an important place in the spread of surrealist ideas within the Serbian cultural context. He was educated in Grenoble, Nice and Paris before he took the position of a philosophy teacher in Belgrade Gymnasium or high school, and he enthusiastically initiated young poets into contemporary theoretical debates on psychoanalysis and surrealism. Later, three of his students became members of Surrealist group, Đorđe Kostić, Đorđe Jovanović and Oskar Davičo, and I will get back to three of them later. Similarly, Aleksandar Vučo was educated in Nice and Paris prior to his return. Prior to his return to Yugoslavia in 1922, where he continued to participate in cultural life of the capital. Together with Marko Ristić, a central figure of the movement, both of them were the founders of the Belgrade Surrealist group, as well as the main editors of their main magazines, L'Impossible that I mentioned, and another one that is called Surrealism Here and Now, that was published in the early 30s. Now let me say a few words about the historical context. So, the first 3 years of the 1930s mark a mature and collective period of Belgrade Surrealists. Following the publication of Breton's second manifesto, this period was largely under the sign of the revolution, and subsequently Belgrade Surrealists attempted to enlist themselves in its service. In the late 1920s, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was going through a significant political crisis. Namely, there was, in response to the political crisis that was triggered by the murder of Stjepan Radić, a member of the parliament, King Aleksandar Karađorđević abolished the constitution, prorogued the parliament, and this instituted a personal dictatorship on January 6th. He also changed the name of the country in Yugoslavia, Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and altered its internal divisions of the country's governance. As you can see here, he was trying to divide administratively country differently so the ethnic animosities would disappear. And this is an interesting moment in history in order to solve something that, as we know through the history, has been problematic in the Balkans and in former Yugoslavia. In the 1931, he decreed a new constitution that transferred executive power to king, which allowed him to directly appoint the half upper of the house in the parliament. And the Croatian Bauhaus student and the female artist Ivana Tobljenović-Miller made the following photomontage illustrating the dire conditions of Aleksandar Karađorđević's dictatorship in the 1930s. In January 1931, the Belgrade Surrealist group published a leaflet called The Position of Surrealism, signed by the 11 members of the group, in which they advocated a collaborative rebellion against any mode of oppression and called openly for socialist revolution, explicitly accepting the Marxist dictum of changing instead of interpreting the world. The rigorous censorship of the king's dictatorship banned this leaflet immediately after its publication, and the direct persecution of the Belgrade Surrealists inevitably pulled them to the greater extremes in their political positions, and eventually the entire movement came to an end. On one hand, the group itself divided into two factions, especially after the Aragon affair, at least partly due to the concrete political problems faced by their country and their attitude towards revolutionary engagement. On the other hand, the regime of the king's dictatorship deliberately decimated the group and put a halt to their activities. This is intentionally black page, so Vučo and Matić gravitated towards different factions within the Belgrade Surrealism. And I would say this was rather ideological polarization within the group rather than some like a formal division of Belgrade Surrealists. So Matić led the fraction which advocated for much more active participation in the revolutionary activities, guided by the ideas of Marxist communism, in which, unsurprisingly, this group comprised all of his former students that he actually initiated to Surrealism in the high school. And this faction believed that if Surrealism wanted to overcome the contemplative attitude and transform the dream into reality, it must turn to the proletariat as the agent of social revolution. Vučo, however, belonged to the opposing faction, gathered around Marko Ristić and Milan Dedinac and Vane Bor, and they were, rather than affirming communism in practice, they attempted to neutralize the autonomy of the artistic field by situating itself in opposition to both bourgeois art and modernist avant-garde, while simultaneously proposing more engaged socialist literature. So they have two different programs, and they are, as I will argue today, both articulated in this interesting collaborative book. So attempts towards compromise between these two factions came too late, since the group actually was cut short by the outside forces. And in an emotionally charged 1933 article, French surrealist René Crevel relates in detail the arrests of several Belgrade surrealists and their detention without trial by the pro-fascist Yugoslav government, linking these arrests to the contemporaneous rise of Nazism in Europe. So Oskar Davičo, one of the Matić's students, was arrested in Bosnian town Bihać, where he had organized the Center for Marxist Research, and was tortured and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Đorđe Kostić was held several months in detention without a trial and was later set free. George Jovanović and Koča Popović had been arrested and were still waiting in jail for a trial at the time when Krevel was writing. Koča Popović was eventually released, while George Jovanović spent 3 years in prison. Matic, Vučo and Dedinac were also arrested and later released, although Krevel did not mention this in his article. So all the members from the faction around Matic ended in prison or in immediate danger, and finally the entire Belgrade Surrealist circle dissipated. So having these historical facts in mind, the case of the fine feats appears even more alluring. On the front cover of the book, under Aleksandar Vučo's name, one finds the enigmatic pseudonym, an anagram of his first name, Askerland. Between 1929 and 1932, he published 3 longer poems in children's section of the daily newspaper Politika, including the fine feats. So Vučo was especially mainly children's literature writer. And he signed this poem with this anagram pseudonym under using his first name, following the advice of the Politika's founder and the main editor, Vladislav Ribnikar, who had warned him that the censor might ban his poem since his name wasn't special police blacklist. And I want to say that Askerland could be read as the land of Asker. Asker is Turkish word for soldier. So the land of Askers or soldiers where there are blacklists. But my question is, what was the reason that both Vučo's poem and this book passed the censorship? Well, most likely the official censorship did not consider literature, children's literature, to be as dangerous as other surrealist publications that launched the open call for social resistance. However, I argue that the case of the fine feats proves the opposite. And this is, in short, my argument. So this is where the Vučo published his poems in the supplement to the daily. So in what follows, I argue that the fine feats is this double-voiced surrealist dispositif, or a suggestion apparatus that is set in motion by the reader-viewer, who, as an important part of this conceptual material circuit of dispositif, participates in an attempt to interrogate the very conditions of the political under modernity and to enact a symbolical destruction of politics. And I will later explain what I understand under political and politics. And I argue that this intervention is made possible through the surrealist collage, which disarticulates elements of social reality to establish unforeseen configurations between these elements. It intervenes in the representation of the world in order to re-articulate elements of the reality and elements of social relations. And I will just talk now about surrealism for children a little bit. So, Vučo's playful verses and Matic's spirited collages provide the book with surreal undertones and special charm of the new. The authors gave the book a new revolutionary form and an example how children's literature should look. The plot of this book is quite simple. It's a sanguine story about a brave and scrappy group of boys who rescue a girl from a convent, also called State Institute for Girls, which is run by evil nuns. The reader follows some sort of filmic narration of the events, mainly unfolding around the convent and the institute. So, Vučo's novel in verse opens in the same manner as Lewis Carroll's The Hunting of the Snark, by describing the main characters of the poem, Crocker, Nori, Johnny, Bulgy, and Captain Joe, as well as the girl, Mira, and the main villain of the story, Sister Calavestra. The boys are described as autonomous individuals, largely independent of any parental supervision. Several of them are explicitly identified as working class or poor. Since the institute convent is located near the Cockerell's playground, they soon discover that Mira is being kept there against her will, and they collectively decide to rescue her from the fiendish nuns who are holding her back. Although their first attempt was well conceived, it fails because one of the boys, Nori, was too hungry. Nori's hunger is both a humorous characteristic, but also a condition that he pointedly shares with many other children living in poverty. At first disappointed by their failure, the cockerels soon come up with a new idea to save Mira with the help of a hot air balloon. They persuade the downtrodden old man lampshade to make them a balloon, and with its help ultimately succeed in rescuing Mira. After determining there is no safe place for them in the city, the children escape to the island park on the city outskirts, where they continue to hide from the society. And this deserted island becomes not only their temporary refuge, but also merry space for enjoying their freedom. And the poem ends with some sort of short verse epilogue, which Aleksandar added for the book, and in which he clearly articulates the political position and emphasizes the social message underlining the entire book. He writes, "Most of the world these days carves to the quote of cash, where fields once bore fruit, now bars those smelling of ash. For most of the world now, the only ones with rights are scoundrels and parasites, while the rest of humankind is neglected." With its sober and critical tone, the epilogue departs from the exciting pell-mell action of the rest of the poem, bringing it more in line with some of the explicit criticism of bourgeois society laid out in Matić's foreword. In contrast to Vučas's verses, the illustrations and accompanied text by Matić are complex, abstract, and dark, to the point that sometimes are being frightening. They indicate much less of an obvious orientation towards children. In the foreword, Matić speaks about the other and different children who were traditionally the object of pity in children's literature rather than its protagonists or implicit readers. In the cinematic manner of montage of attractions, his foreword, written engagingly and mindful of the entire poem, touches upon many subjects, including even like a murder that happened in Zagreb, and connecting them to the unexpected junctions between the aesthetics and the ideology. Matić openly directs his critique against the interest of bourgeois Weltanschauung regarding a fundamental and critical societal problem, children's education and upbringing, how children are raised by their parents and society. He writes, "These grown-ups puffed up like enormous bagpipes or long and thin like pokers wearing pants, they have evidently packed away their memories like useless old toys in the attic. They forget their chicken brains by the bathroom sink where they wash up in the morning. Now they're walking to the house and sitting in offices and talking about how they work for the sake of their children's happiness." Matić asserts that the bourgeois system of child rearing is based on the bourgeoisie investing into their children the capital of their own prejudice, norms, and prohibitions. Emphasizing the social differences between child readers and the conditions of their respective education, he concludes, "On one side, there are children of poverty, on the other side, children of the rich. The first are debased by poverty, and the others are disfigured by wealth. Children, like the majority of grown-ups, are the victims of this society. But the true childhood, which they want to suppress," Matić declares, "squeezes up through the threatening stones, the heavy slaps, cruel words, schoolhouse lies, curses, poverty, and wealth." Belgrade Surrealists believe that the true childhood is representative of true desire, and that it penetrates the bourgeois stiffness and seriousness and serious rationality of adults. Such a breakthrough to the clutches and grits of psychophysical discipline is given shape, according to them, in dreams, humor, and poetry. Matić encapsulates the significance and true meaning of poetry for children. The principles of poetry and childhood are, in essence, one and the same. It is, according to them, the principle of desire that is in antagonism with the repressive mechanism of contemporary society. It questions all education, even morality. Similarly, Vuccio identifies children as the main actors of his poems with the real surrealism. In the interview that he gave from the 1960s, Vuccio asserted that the children are genuine surrealists who observe the world through the eyes of a dreamer, who want to escape the everyday reality and to think about the non-existent, who are irreconcilable with stagnation, and who refuse to accept borders between the real and the imaginary, possible and impossible, and whose spirit is guided by freedom. At the end, Vuccio states that the children love to jump over the barriers and to demolish them, both literally and figuratively. And I will come back to this concept of barriers. The poem features a series of elements that are undoubtedly surrealistic, and I will just go quickly around. So they talk about the feelings of melancholy and spleen, the palpable fear, alongside spirited evocations of everyday life. There is significant playfulness with language throughout the poem, and I will, as an example, just give you a little sequence from the fourth episode, which addresses the dream of one of the heroes. He's looking at a yellow parlor. The parlor floor is growing grass. There is a cow wearing two hats. One hat is a black storm cloud. The other hat is a pure white flag. The cow is wearing two dish rags. Dish rag 1's a pale grey digger. Dish rag 2's a jockey blue. The cow is bearing two broad plates. From the first, the wild wind plays. From the second, like rainfall, all in tears, cut out from paper, and some fabric soft as vapor, head over heels, our Mira falls. Although both Vuccio's verses and Matic's prose interludes contain elements of the surrealistic program, they are, as Marko Ristic noticed, creatively overruled. Everything is subordinated to the logical flow of the narrative, and this element of rationalization is explained by the poem's social function. Children are not faced with lies and conventions, but they themselves become the agents of their own actions, freedom, and unconventionality. And in front of us develops this image of the real contemporary Belgrade. So the poem, for example, addresses the flights of August Picard that were also addressed in the daily Politica. Likewise, the poem talks about nearby island, river island, Ada Ciganlija, which is a popular recreation site in Belgrade. The poem also refers to the popular cafe, and also all the photographs that we see, the photograph clipping that are used in the collages, are actually putting forward a concrete realism of the photographic image, if you want. So the authors thus suggest that children can imagine building a new life in their existing environment, while making clear the uncompromising terms of struggle against the lies and hypocrisy that permeate the world of adults. And I will further talk about surrealist concepts. So these are the key surrealist concepts as points of orientation that both structure the narrative in the poem and permeate it with surrealist meanings. And the first one is the wall. So the concept of the barriers which bourgeois society imposes through education and promotion of class values is most precisely represented by the conceptual surrealist image of the wall, which was articulated and conceived through the medium of photography. Nicola Vuccio, Aleksandar Vuccio's younger brother, took the photograph The Wall of Agnosticism during his stay in Paris, a year before it was published in the Almanac L'Impossible. Depicting the lined bricks on the bank of Seine, the photograph is divorced from time and place, and yet it precisely pinpoints the anxiety of the epoch. By focusing on the seemingly hidden detail of a familiar mass-produced object such as a building block, Vuccio extends the boundaries of the artistic and architectural fields of action. However, when this title is cross-referenced in the text appearing in the journal, we can see that the photograph acquires additional meanings. This becomes the wall of agnosticism, irony, and indifference bourgeois society so persistently constructs in defiance to the essential fire and real consciousness. Consequently, this wall of agnosticism is not just a set of more or less anonymous building blocks, but it becomes a visual metaphor of agnosticism and indifference that refers to the opaque wall raised between the spectator and the world, but also between surrealism and the bourgeois milieu. Matic's photomontage on the front cover of the book not only reiterates the sequencing pattern of Nikola Vuča's photograph, but it also functions as both a visual synecdoche of the convent or institute and a visual metaphor of the meanings accumulated around this double-named institution. All the attributes of the wall, stiffness, inflexibility, even invincibility, simultaneously match up to the primary character features of the main poem antagonist, the nun in charge of the convent or institute, Sister Calavestra, who is, quote, so creepy that when she appears all the children's faces turn pale. So Calavestra embodies rigidity, strictness and discipline, and her stern educational measures create an atmosphere diametrically opposite to the free life outside the institute, as exemplified by the feisty, companionable and playful coveralls. Matic's front cover photomontage is significant at least for three reasons. First, it functions as a so-called initial formula in fairy tales. Second, through repetition, spacing and doubling, it creates a visual rhyme and simultaneously implies the reference to the double name of the institution and the dual role of the textual and visual media in the book. And third, this doubling spacing provides a meta-commentary on the concept of the interval that I will talk soon. But let's first talk about the marvelous. So while the initial formula in fairy tales, once upon a time in a certain kingdom, beyond thrice three realms, etc., when this initial formula transports readers to a magical world that is detached from our own space and time, Matic's photomontage introduces the visual chronotype of real space and linear time. Namely, the initial formula of fairy tales carries the readers or listeners into the archaic, primordial, mythical time that is beyond reach. Matic's photomontage, however, represents modern linear time through the successive sequence of snapshots of the immutable wall and the girl in different poses, thus suggesting the movement of this girl from captivity to liberation, and also a scene sequence of a storyboard. At the same time, this simultaneous representation of successive sequences suggests that the reality into which Matic's photomontage transposes us still retains its magic properties. Namely, the Surrealists were particularly fond of photomontage for its capacity to reveal the marvelous as property of the real, making it an ideal new revolutionary means of representation. In the foreword, Matic offers his theory of photocollage and reflects on its capacity to intervene in the representation of the world. He writes the following: "Scissors draw. Books without pictures are boring," says Alice in Wonderland. Books with pictures can at least be looked at. In Russia, all children's books have pictures. When you've looked at the pictures 100 times and get tired of them, let the scissors out to graze on them. Scissors are quicker than a kangaroo. Snip off that fellow's moustache and paste it onto the stove. Cut off the little girl's legs and glue them to the door. Why should doors always be only open or closed? Let them take a walk. This is how you get a cut and paste picture. A picture opportunity, a picture feeling. This is how you take immobile picture tombs and turn them into a living picture, a live picture. This is how you bring together pictures parted forever and how you get the pictures you want, desire pictures. So this experience of reality as representation is at the heart of both photographic medium and surrealist thinking. It enables Matic to recognize the marvelous not only in the stories but also in real life. commenting on the difference between the classic folk tales and contemporary fiction based on a strange experience of the world around us, he writes the following. A child senses that the enchanted land his grannies and aunties told him about, as if it was somewhere far, far away, is here, quite nearby, somewhere right next to him. He senses that wonderful things didn't only happen to fairy tale princesses or magic winds, they also happen to the children and grown-ups all around him. So, in the cover image, Matic employs also spacing and doubling, thus creating visual rhymes through these repetitive patterns. For example, the image of 5 cockerels behind the window grids rhymes with the 5 images of Mira in different body positions. This rhyme also evokes the structure of Vuča's poem, which has 5 episodes, while the 6th one serves as a sort of epilogue. The wall on the cover is also divided into these repetitive gray fragments by doubling and spacing, resembling the monotonous pattern of the hollow, mass-produced building blocks in Nikola Vuča's photograph. Lastly, the repetitive white spacing lines on the wall rhyme with the pattern of black grids on the window. Beyond the visual register, the strategy of spacing and doubling reappears as double naming of the institute and convent. This doubling is significant since it refers to the strong political bond between the church and the state, the dual institutional roots of the same rule of sovereignty. The wall signifies both monolithic construction and monarchical constitution of the existing Yugoslav autocratic government. Furthermore, the convent institute wall functions as an all-embracing sign for the monumentalizing forces that tend to canonize the social and everyday life practices, which rest on the hegemonic system of petty bourgeois values and virtues. As a complex sign, the convent institute consequently becomes one of the important actors, or better, actants of the entire photo poem. And as you know, the French semiotician Algerdas Julien Grimas introduced the concept of actant to extend the concept of actor, right, to non-living beings, right? And Bruno Latour will take over that same concept in his own theory. And the last but not least, the interval. So Matic's front cover introduces a meta-commentary on the concept of the interval. And this commentary is embodied in the image of the window in the wall. Formally speaking, the window is a framed hole, a gap, a fissure in the wall that enables visual access to representations of space both outside and inside the wall. But this framed gap does not belong to either of these two spaces. Rather, it is the space in between them. Further, as a gap between two different spaces, the window allows for simultaneous access into two different temporalities arrested by and within their spatial representations. And again, this framed gap does not belong to either of these temporalities. Rather, it is a sign for the location of the present moment between its relation to the past and its anticipation of the future. The window thus becomes a visual representation of the interval. It has a double spatio-temporal meaning. It refers to the space or time in between space and time, and it indicates a spatio-temporal difference that marks departure and anticipates arrival, both temporal and spatial, but never a certain presence. It functions as a self-reflective sign for the difference assigned to the space and the moment hovering between Mira's imprisonment and her salvation. Needless to say, the reader-viewer is put precisely in Mira's position, causing us to awaken from and rebel against tacitly accepted approaches to the world installed by the bourgeois education. Here is actually how Matic's photomontage functions within 5 feet as a text with this logical structure, just to illustrate what this gap actually means. Namely, accompanying the poem Each of the 5 photo collages narrates both visually and verbally what happened in the meantime, what happened in between the events described by Vuča's verses. And this is very important because all photo collages are addressing, explaining, and showing the events that are set in a narrative spatio-temporal gap or a pocket or interval. And moreover, the very materiality of the book, when you look at the facsimile, shows that these pages with photo collages in their explanatory text are literally inserted between the pages with verses, illustrating this maybe on a material level. So bear with me, I know this may be too much. There is more coming. So I want to just do a little close reading of one of these photo collages and to maybe wrap up everything to connect all of these different layers that I talked about. So let's look at this photo collage, which is photo collage number 2. This one fills the spatio-temporal gap provided by Vuča's verses, represented the events that are completely outside of Vuča's narrative. Matić supplements the existing temporal pocket in the narrative with specific verbal and visual content and transports the viewer-reader inside the state institute or convent, within its dark interior, the maze of its cellars. Matić's photo collage thus marks the departure from Vuča's text, but also it anticipates the arrival of Mira's rescuers. We see from the Institute cellar one member of the Cockerell's gang, Crocker, and we read how he winks at Mira, letting her know that her savers have arrived. This photo collage presents the Convent Institute as one of the main villains or actants of the poem. The cellar in particular represents the literal darkness of the repression practiced by the double institution, the State Institute for Girls and the Church, right, being the convent, thus signifying the Karađorđević's autocratic dictatorship through the link between the two. Both the photo collage and the accompanying text share the formulaic structure in which the experience of imprisonment is created and made palpable by this horrific repetition of the same. The same image of the swarm of nuns, which are compared to the whitewashed cockroaches or the painted ladybugs, or by the repetition of the formulaic syntagm, then the sister, then the sister, then the sister at the beginning of each of these paragraphs. The scene described in Matić's accompanying prose is filled with the symbolic and actual violence. The nuns' treatment of Mira is reminiscent of the interrogation processes practiced during the Spanish Inquisition or the fascist purges. It can also be easily read as a commentary on the interrogations of several Belgrade Surrealists during Karađorđević's dictatorship. The description of this interrogation process heavily employs Christian symbols, the soul, vinegar, Lord's Prayer, crosses, and fish. Furthermore, Matić's caption even conveys a sense of speech which visuals are unable to communicate. Namely, the nuns are fiercely passionate in their loquacity, and Matić uses very picturesque language to convey the force of their dogmatic zeal. But the whole photomontage features a still more striking example of this brutal oppression that are associated with the rise of fascist, anti-revolutionary and anti-surrealist terror. The description of Sister Calavestra threatening to force Mira to eat the cross, which she calls the real castor oil for the purification of soul. Namely, force-feeding resistors with castor oil was a common means of punishment practiced by the black shirts in fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini's regime. Even Mayakovsky, for example, addresses this in his 1923 caricature of Mussolini. Matić thus compares barefoot Mira with those political dissidents who were force-fed large quantities of castor oil by the fascist squads, thus implicitly associating practices of Yugoslav secret police with those of Mussolini's black shirts. By intervening in Vuča's representation of children's world, Matić makes a clear statement about the oppressive political conditions in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. In addition, Matic's text and collage introduced surrealist poetic parody as a key surrealist technique. When, for example, one of the sisters demands from Mira to recite the Lord's Prayer, Mira responds with the following verses that are a parodic pastiche made from different elements mentioned in her previous exchange with the nuns. Mira is practicing actually the downgrading of the holiest prayer in Christianity. This is the blasphemy as irreverence towards religious or holy persons or things that are very specific for Belgrade Surrealists because they were all, of course, communist and against the church and monarchy. So I argue that Vučos and Matic's surrealist dispositif establishes an attempt to interrogate the very conditions of the political under modernity to enact the symbolic destruction of Yugoslav politics through disrupting its representation. Here I have in mind the distinction between the politics and political made by Claude Lefort. According to Lefort, politics describes the particular institutional forms of political organization in a given society. So, political parties, all legal institutions that we know. Whereas the political describes the original founding moment that constitutes the social space, or that society. And the value of creative endeavor for surrealists was to articulate a moment of political possibility through the production of disruptive images, strategies already developed through the theory of surrealist image and technique of collage. The surrealist image, as well as collage, is not dependent on established canons of meaning. Rather, it opens an interval between sense and meaning, allowing it to manifest an experience of freedom. The image of collage functions as a matrix that disarticulates elements of social reality in order to establish unforeseen configuration between these elements and to rearticulate the social relations. Matic's photo collages establish a narrative program that works against narrative closure and the closure of political possibility in a twofold manner. First, they create the gap at place and in moment when this gap appears as non-existent. Second, as photo collages that are made by the procedure of montage, they point to the static forces in both political and narrative power by performing a radical intervention, a cut into the tissue of the organic model of growth and its classic and largely dominant bourgeois assumptions of harmony, unity, and closure. In his foreword, Matic reflects on the role of photo collage to intervene in the representation of the world, to question the very conditions of the political under modernity, and more importantly, to perform destruction proper of politics. He writes, "In order to make a better order for people and for children, an order that will not be a tree-lined alley, a model, a bench, that will not be a torture, what needs to happen is to scatter the existing pictures, alleys, models, benches, etc. in every direction, and that these pictures, alleys, models, branches, etc. humanely explode." Vučos' poem ends with a final photo collage accompanied by a short sentence that shifts our attention from the interval towards the future and explains what happens next. And that's how the boys set off for new feats and new life. As one can see on this photo montage, the wall, the institute or the convent, its walls, and by extension the politics, the institutions, are smashed to smithereens. The brave new kids are occupying the ruins. They play amid the remnants of what was. The factory chimneys in the background are in fact taken from Charles Schiller's photographs of a Ford plant in Detroit. They stand as an important emblem of modernity and foreshadow subsequent socialist industrialization. High in the sky is the 5-point star, an open allusion to Soviet communism, which was quite a risky gesture in 1933, since the Communist Party in Yugoslavia was banned in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So as you all know, the communists came out of the Second World War in Yugoslavia as the victors. many surrealists joined partisans who were fighting, you know, the Germans occupiers, Italians as occupiers, but also domestic enemies like ultra-nationalists of Nazi puppet state in Croatia, Ustašas, but also the monarchical army, Chetniks. And Koča Popović, who was detained in 1933, became Tito's right hand during the Second World War. He was also, let's say, was a volunteer in Spanish Civil War, and he was very skillful commander, guerrilla fighter. And after the Second World War, he even served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs because he was, of course, fluent in French and knew many languages. He was one who designed also non-alignment movement, one of the designers of the non-alignment movement that Yugoslavia's foreign policy was known of. Marko Ristić became a Yugoslav ambassador in Paris, among other things, but he also served as the president of the Yugoslav National Committee for UNESCO. Aleksandar Vučo served as the director of the film companies in Yugoslavia, and these film companies did a lot of production for Hollywood in the 60s. Dušan Matić also was in the film industry, but worked as a professor at the Academy of Film and Radio and Television. You can even see two of them sitting at the center. So this is like Matinee from 1974. Maybe you've heard of Ivo Andrić, right, the Nobel Prize winner, but there is Neša Selimović, Bosnian writer, Miloš Crnjanski, so there was like the main modernist writer, Yugoslav. Here are in the center are Matić and Vučo, and Basko Popa next to them. This is another poet, Raičević, and Branko Ćopić, and there's a literary critic at the corner. So they are like occupying the central position, right, in this literary matinee. After the World War, so since 1945, the Fine Feats was republished several times, but only edition from 1959 included Matić's photo collages. And later editions, although this one was featuring photo collages in much reduced quality and size, the later editions completely get rid of the photo collages, of the foreword, of the explanations that Matić has inside. And obviously that historical circumstances had changed in socialist Yugoslavia. The winners no longer needed to question the politics, let alone to perform its symbolic destruction. Namely, they needed to defend it along the entire Yugoslav socialist state apparatus. And the next wave of the subversive voices belonged to the generation who grew up reading these books and being educated by these surrealists as well, and who expressed themselves in a completely different medium, in the medium of film, and this generation is known more as black wave film directors, but that's another topic. Thank you so much for bearing with me.